Happy Thursday to the students from our Isaiah class that we just started last night. I wanted to give an opportunity here to just sort of go through a little bit of the extra material that we didn't have time to cover in last night's class. And for those of you that are enjoying this study and that want to make sure that you've got as much of the information as possible, I just thought maybe this is a good way to respect our time that we have at an assembly, but also to be able to cover what's left. And so that's really all that we're doing here. And so anyway, we'll be able to show the charts. You'll be able to see that as we go through, and hopefully just a little extra, maybe 10 minutes here. We'll cover what we didn't get to last night, and that'll help us to kind of flesh out and have a more complete picture of what we were trying to get accomplished, trying to learn in our study last night. So when you think about Isaiah, one of the things that we talked about last night is the historical placement of the book, that it's about 250 years after King David. It's about 100 years before captivity happens. And Isaiah's writing falls round about 700 years before Jesus comes on the scene. So I made a mention in passing last night that this is around the same time when the city of Lachish falls. And I wanted to give you a little bit more complete info on that. So in 2 Kings 19, you have the story of the king of Assyria coming up against Jerusalem. And there's an interaction there between Isaiah and King Hezekiah, where Isaiah is telling him, don't worry about things. And then obviously the king of Assyria is sending messages, and he's saying, you should worry and you should not put your trust and your faith in your God, because look at these other nations that trusted their gods and I defeated them. But, Hezekiah obviously does what's right. And this is why we talked about in class last night. This is a very near miss in some ways for the people of the southern kingdom, because the Assyrians are basically right on the doorstep. And then God defeats the king of Assyria, Sennacherib, and his army, and sends them home basically with their tails tucked. And it is a remarkable story, but it is also remarkable because there's a brief mention of this. It's 2 Kings 19, in verse 8. There's a passing reference made there to the fact that the king had been fighting against Lachish, had been sieging the city of Lachish, and history tells us, the rest of the way that played out is Lachish did fall to Assyria at this same time. And so anyway, I'll put it up here on the screen and just show you that there's also this really wonderful relief that's been found in some of the archaeological digs. That is it's the Assyrian depiction of their siege of the city of Lachish and the fall of the Israelite city to the Assyrian army. And the closer you look at it, the more sad it becomes, the more real it starts to feel, at least for me. But it's a pretty remarkable archaeological find, that it's like so specific and so graphic a depiction of something that we know happened to the Jewish people a long time ago during that time. And this would have been an event that Isaiah knew about, and it had to be at least in the back of their minds, he and his people, as they were thinking about their relationship with God and the progress of what their kingdom was becoming and how things were shaping up politically around them on the world scene. So anyway, wanted to give you that little bit of follow-up there for the historical piece. Okay, moving back to an idea that we had to skip from our slides in class last night. Let's talk about the man himself, Isaiah. Somebody mentioned at the very beginning of our class last night that his name means Yahweh is salvation. That's a great insight there. Very helpful for us to think about. It's helpful because a lot of his message also means Yahweh is salvation. And so the fact that the people have fallen away from God, they've rejected him, they've rebelled against him in a lot of ways, means they've rejected his salvation, but it doesn't mean that he's given up on them entirely. And so the message at the end of the book is going to come back to keep being the meaning of Isaiah's name, that Yahweh will still be your salvation. Okay, we learn about him in the first verse of the book that he is the son of Amos. That is not the same as Amos, the prophet from later in the Bible. We don't really know who any more than that. We know his father's name. We don't know who that is. We also learn in a couple of different places in the book, one in particular is Isaiah 8, verse 3, that he is a married man. And so it talks about him going to the prophetess and her conceiving and giving birth to their son. one of the ongoing questions about her identity. Number one, she's never named, and so one of the ongoing questions is she called the prophetess because she also prophesies, or is she called the prophetess because she is the wife of the prophet, kind of in Jerusalem, Isaiah kind of being like the guy who fills that role, no one knows, either one is equally plausible in my mind, that she very well could have prophesied and also been somebody who by inspiration of the Spirit spoke truth. That's not unusual. Deborah did that. And there's a reference to several daughters of one man who all prophesied in the book of Acts. And so it wouldn't be crazy. It wouldn't be out of the ordinary. It wouldn't be, I say maybe out of the ordinary. It wouldn't be completely implausible. But we just don't know which is the case in terms of Isaiah's wife. We also know that Isaiah is the father of two sons, and their names are given for us in chapter 7, verse 3, and in chapter 8, verse 3. Those names have some deep meanings that have a lot to do with what's going on with Judah at the time, but we really don't read about them other than their names having some meaning that plays into God's perspective on how Israel is behaving, how his people are behaving toward him at the time. Let's see. It's important for us to remember as well, last line that you see here on the little chart, it's important to remember that Isaiah is the first prophet who is sent to the southern kingdom. And that is a pretty significant thing. The northern kingdom has been dealing with prophets for a while, and the prophets have been dealing with the kings of the northern kingdom for a while. But Isaiah is the first one that we read about being commissioned to go and speak to God's people in the southern kingdom, because at this point in their history, their spirituality is starting to suffer pretty significantly as well. And so it's an indicator of how far they've fallen, that now God is sending them a messenger to say, come back to me. And that's been the case. That's been the case up in their northern counterpart for a generation or more. But it's really starting to become that way in the southern kingdoms also. Again, one of the things that's been noted often about Isaiah is his command of language, his writing style, his depth of thought, his poetic beauty. Like, everything is good about Isaiah. And so comments like this one show up in commentaries all the time. And we read this last night. He has at his command a vocabulary richer than that of any prophet, even more comprehensive than the book of Psalms. You're like, wow, so it kind of makes you wonder, what sort of man is he? What station in life does he hold? What sort of education does he have that he would be able to write like this? The answer is we don't know, specifically. But some of the speculations and the legends, I guess, that surround him may help to flesh that out a little bit. It's possible, it's maybe even likely, that Isaiah was a member of the royal court. He may have even been a royal family member related to the king in some way. Don't know for sure, but it would make sense of how he writes, how close he is, how he sees certain things. It's also possible that, unlike, for example, Amos is a farmer, who is called by God to go and become a prophet to the people. It's possible that in Isaiah's case, he may have been basically the prophet on retainer for the royal house, that he's there as an advisor, almost employed as an advisor to the king, in a similar way to, like, in later a couple of generations later in the story of Joash, there is a prophet named Jehoiada who is kind of always at the right hand of the king as an advisor, a spiritual advisor. Maybe that's what we're looking at with Isaiah in this particular generation, that he's filling that role. Again, hard to know for sure, but it would make sense of what we're seeing in the context and how he approaches certain things. It's also possible, and this is a long-standing legend, but there's nothing really to validate or verify it. It's also possible that Isaiah lived into the time of the king after Hezekiah. So chapter 1, verse 1 mentions up to the point of Hezekiah. It's possible that he may have lived into the time of Manasseh. And because Manasseh, we're told in 2 Chronicles 33, filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, the legend has been for a long time that Isaiah was killed by order of King Manasseh for being the prophetic voice, the old man prophetic voice who was calling the people back to faithfulness in Yahweh alone. And it may be, it's also been suggested anyway, that the reference made in Hebrews 11 verse 37 to somebody being sawn in two for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of faithfulness to God, that may be a reference to Isaiah and how he died. But again, we really just don't know for sure. Okay, so thinking about all of that and thinking about how Isaiah, how he preached and what messages he had and how he carried forward the will of God and how he was faithful to God and how he related to his people, it just kind of made me wonder how would Isaiah's writings have been received, you know? And I think there's basically two different ways that we can kind of assume, and admittedly that's what we're doing here, but we can kind of assume that Isaiah's writings, his teachings landed for people differently based on when they heard them first. So I think for his contemporaries, for the people that lived at the same time that were hearing this for the first time it was being preached or written, he probably sounded eloquent, but I have a feeling he sounded like he was, calling the sky was falling here. He probably sounded pretty pessimistic. And to them, it was probably one of those times where they looked around and went, I don't know, man, everything looks pretty good to me. I don't know what you're saying is so bad. But then, of course, generations later, when they've been to exile and they've come back and they've seen everything that happened and they've heard the other prophets talk about how spiritually, how seriously the people had failed in their spiritual lives, Isaiah probably sounded brilliant. They probably went back to his writings and thought, man, we should have been paying attention to this all along. And it was probably a very convicting read later when other prophets and scribes revisited his writings. It was probably one of those times where they went, he called every single bit of this, and we should have been paying attention, and we failed miserably. So I thought it was really helpful. One commentator compared, and I'll put the quote here for you so you can read it on the screen. One commentator compared the way that Isaiah writes for the future generation to a grandfather writing a letter to his granddaughter that will be read on her wedding day. So let's just read this together. This is a really good comparison, and we'll end with this. And hopefully it kind of helps us to realize a little bit what we're dealing with maybe, how did Isaiah's writings land on the hearts of the people in a later generation? So here it is. Isaiah's rhetorical approach in chapters 40 through 66 may be compared to an aging grandfather who writes a letter to his baby granddaughter and seals it with the word, to be opened on your wedding day. He knows he may not live to see his granddaughter's wedding, but he projects himself into the future and speaks to her as if he were actually present on her wedding day. And I have a feeling that especially when they read the later chapters of Isaiah, from like he's talking about here from chapter 40 to 66, that they almost felt Isaiah's presence with them, where these things are being fulfilled, and especially for people like Simeon or Anna, those two people mentioned in Luke chapter 2, that were in the temple waiting for the baby Jesus to be brought in, especially for people who had their kind of faithful hearts, that they heard Isaiah's words, and especially when they saw Messiah begin his work, that they really took to heart the beauty and the blessing of being told all of this, generations, 700 years before it actually happened. And so anyway, I hope that thinking about some of that helps us to flesh out a little bit more of our picture from last night of what we studied. And I hope that this study overall is going to be enjoyable for you and helpful for you, as well as, like always, what we're trying to do is understand Jesus better and serve him more faithfully. So I hope this is a good effort to help you do that.